There's one sentence in John 21 that almost everyone reads past. The net was not torn. That doesn't sound important, until you discover this wasn't the first miraculous catch of fish. 3 years earlier, Jesus performed almost the exact same miracle. But that time, the net ripped apart. Same lake, same fisherman, same Jesus. So why did one net break and the other didn't? John's gospel ends with one of the most specific numbers in the entire New Testament. After a miraculous catch of fish on the Sea of Galilee, the text doesn't round the number or leave it vague. It tells us exactly how many, 153. And then it adds a detail that sounds almost like an afterthought. For all there were so many, yet was not the net broken. John 21:11. That single clause is easy to read past. A net holding under a heavy catch doesn't sound like the kind of thing worth building an investigation around. But John rarely writes incidental details, and this is not the first time this exact miracle happens to these exact men. It's the second time. And the first time on this same lake, with some of these same hands on the rope, the text tells us something very different happened to the net. 2 catches, one lake, roughly 3 years apart in the actual chronology of the story. And at the exact point where the 2 accounts should simply repeat each other, they diverge. Sharply, specifically in a single clause most readers scroll straight past on their way to counting the fish. Most readers treat the number 153 as a curiosity, the kind of specific detail an eyewitness remembers, filed away as interesting trivia, nothing more. And the note about the net not breaking usually gets read as simple scene description. It held, end of story, on to the next verse. But John doesn't write incidental details. Nearly everything in his gospel that looks like a small aside turns out to be doing real interpretive work once you slow down and check it against the rest of the chapter. A pronoun, a number, a location, a piece of clothing someone puts on before jumping into water. This chapter alone is stacked with exactly that kind of detail, and almost none of them get read as more than local color on a first pass. So here's the question worth actually investigating. What was different about this second catch, different enough that the very thing that failed the first time succeeds now? And what does that difference tell us about what had actually changed in the men holding the net? To see the difference, we have to go back to the first time, years earlier, at the very start of Jesus' public ministry. Peter, at this point, isn't yet a formally called disciple. He's a working fisherman on the Sea of Galilee, a freshwater lake roughly 13 miles long that supported a real regional fishing economy in the first century, worked by family crews using weighted, hand-cast nets from small wooden boats. Jesus borrows Peter's boat to teach a crowd gathered on the shore, and afterward tells him to push out into deep water and let down the nets. Peter's answer is telling, and worth hearing in full. Master, we have toiled all the night and have taken nothing. Nevertheless, at thy word, I will let down the net. Luke 5:5. He's exhausted, professionally skeptical, and obeys anyway. Not because he expects results, but because of who's asking. What happens next is almost violent in its abundance. Luke 5:6 records the result in a single blunt sentence. They enclosed a great multitude of fishes, and their net brake. It doesn't hold. Peter has to signal his partners in the other boat to come help, and Luke tells us both boats began to sink under the weight of the catch. Luke 5:7. Peter's response to all of this isn't excitement. It's fear. He falls at Jesus' knees and says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." Luke 5:8. Abundance, in that first scene, exposes something in Peter he isn't ready to stand next to. It's worth pausing on one more detail from that first scene before moving forward, because John reuses it too. When Jesus first approaches the disciples from the shore in John 21, before they recognize him, he calls out a single word. Children, have you any food? John 21:5. The Greek word there, paideia, is an affectionate, familiar term. Not the address of a stranger sizing up a boat of anonymous fishermen, but something closer to how you'd call out to people you already know well. The disciples don't recognize the voice yet, but the text has already told the reader, through word choice alone, that whoever is speaking already knows exactly who he's talking to. That's the first catch, and everything folded quietly into it. Now we're ready to see exactly how differently the second one plays out, and how much has changed in between. The setup in John 21 is almost a deliberate replay, and the parallels are worth listing precisely, because they're what make the differences meaningful rather than coincidental. The disciples have fished all night and caught nothing, John 21:3. The identical circumstance as Luke 5. A figure on the shore, whom they don't yet recognize as Jesus, tells them to cast the net on the right side of the boat, John 21:6. They obey a stranger's instruction, exactly as Peter once obeyed Jesus' instruction the first time. And once again the catch is overwhelming, so much so that the disciples can't haul the net into the boat at all. But this time, the text specifically tells us the outcome is different at the exact point where the first story failed. Verse 11, 153 large fish, and yet was not the net broken. Same lake, same miracle. Same overwhelming abundance. Opposite result. The net isn't the only thing behaving differently the second time. Look at what Peter himself does. In Luke 5, faced with the abundance, Peter's instinct is to ask Jesus to leave. He feels the distance between his own sinfulness and what he's just witnessed, and abundance makes that distance feel unbearable. In John 21, once the disciple whom Jesus loved says, "It is the Lord," Peter doesn't create distance. He puts on his outer garment, which he'd taken off to work, and plunges into the water to reach Jesus before the boat can even get there. John 21:7. Covering roughly 200 cubits, close to 100 yards, by whatever combination of swimming and wading he could manage, rather than waiting the few minutes it would have taken the boat to land. Notice, too, the small physical detail John includes almost in passing. Peter had stripped down to work, as fishermen commonly did, and puts his outer garment back on specifically before entering the water. An odd choice if the goal were simply speed, but a natural one if the goal was to appear before Jesus properly clothed rather than stripped bare, the very opposite instinct of hiding or creating distance. Every detail in this half of the scene points the same direction, toward Jesus, not away from him. The same man, faced with the same kind of overwhelming, undeserved provision, moves in the opposite direction the second time. That's not incidental characterization tucked into the margins of the story. It's the human counterpart to what's happening with the net, and it's the first clue that this second catch is doing more than repeating the first one. There's a detail worth pulling in from even earlier than Luke 5, the actual moment James and John are first called as disciples. Matthew 4:21 finds them in a boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. The Greek word behind mending is katartizo. In English, mending sounds like a small patch job, a quick fix to get back to work as fast as possible. The Greek word carries a fuller sense, restoring something to its complete, intended working condition, not merely stopping a leak. It's the same word family the New Testament elsewhere uses for restoring a person rather than an object. Though it's worth being precise here, that's a shared vocabulary across different New Testament authors writing different books, not a claim that Matthew was consciously pointing forward to a scene he couldn't have known was coming. Still, the resonance is worth noticing on its own terms. This whole occupation, nets tearing under strain, being pulled in, being fully restored, going back out, was already the daily rhythm of these men's working lives. Long before anyone in the story could have known how directly that rhythm was about to describe more than fishing equipment. A torn net was never a career-ending event for a first-century fisherman. It was simply Tuesday. You mended it, and you went back out the next night. That ordinary, unremarkable expectation that torn things get fully restored, not discarded, is the exact framework this chapter is about to apply to a person instead of a piece of equipment. It's worth pausing on the number itself, because there's genuine, long-standing disagreement about what, if anything, it symbolizes. An honest documentary should show that disagreement rather than pick a side and pretend it's settled. The earliest recorded explanation comes from Jerome, writing centuries after the Gospel itself. He points to an ancient Greek poem on fishing, the Haleutica by Oppian, which catalogs 153 known species of fish in the ancient world. Read that way, the number becomes a symbol of totality. Every kind of person gathered into the net without exception, none too strange or too small to be included. A different ancient explanation comes from Augustine, who notices that 153 is what mathematicians call a triangular number. It's the sum of every whole number from 1 to 17 added together. He then connects 17 to the 10 Commandments plus the sevenfold Holy Spirit described in Isaiah 11. Law and grace combined into one complete number. It's an intricate argument, and even Augustine doesn't present it as certain. He offers it as a meditation worth sitting with, not a proof to be defended. And a considerably more restrained position, held by a number of modern scholars, including Richard Bauckham, treats the number simply as the kind of exact detail a genuine eyewitness naturally remembers and reports. Evidence of testimony, of someone who was actually there and counted, not necessarily a coded message at all. It's worth noting what all three explanations share, even in their disagreement. None of them treats the number as filler. Whether it points to universality, to a layered numerical design, or simply to the reliability of an eyewitness who happened to count, every serious reading agrees the number was worth including at all, which is itself a small piece of evidence that this chapter rewards exactly the kind of close attention this documentary is giving it. All three readings are worth knowing, and none of them is required to make the point this documentary is actually built on, which sits in the next two details, one about a fire and one about a promise. Once the disciples reach shore, John adds a small, specific detail. They saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid thereon, and bread. The Greek word translated fire of coals is anthrakia, and this word appears in exactly one other place in the entire New Testament. The only other occurrence is in John 18:18 during Jesus' trial, where Peter is warming himself at a charcoal fire in the high priest's courtyard. The very fire beside which he denies knowing Jesus 3 times. 2 appearances of a rare word, in the same gospel, both involving the same man, at his 2 lowest and highest moments in the entire story. That's not the kind of coincidence careful readers of John are used to dismissing. John's gospel is built on exactly this kind of quiet, deliberate echo, and commentators have long noted this particular one as a strong candidate for authorial intent rather than accident. Whatever is about to happen next to Peter, John has already told us, through the choice of a single rare word, that it's going to happen beside the same kind of fire where he fell apart. If the net's survival wasn't luck, what was it? 2 New Testament writers, in 2 separate letters, use closely related language to describe how God actively preserves what belongs to him. Language worth setting directly beside this scene, and worth checking against a third, independent voice. Jesus' own. Peter, the same man who once watched his own net tear, later writes to describe an inheritance reserved in heaven, and adds that believers themselves are kept by the power of God. The Greek word behind kept there is phrurio, a military term for guarding a position or garrisoning a city. It's not passive protection, it's active defense, the kind that requires ongoing effort from whoever is doing the guarding. Paul, writing independently, prays that believers would be preserved blameless, using the Greek word tereo. Watching over something continuously, so that nothing under that watch is lost through neglect or distraction. And Jesus himself, earlier in John's Gospel, makes the identical claim in his own voice, using different vocabulary entirely in the Shepherd Discourse. I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. A fourth voice adds one more piece worth, including, the short letter of Jude closes with a doxology addressed directly to him that is able to keep you from falling and to present you faultless. Jude 24. The Greek there, philasso, is a close cousin of the military guard sense already found in frurio, again describing active defense rather than passive luck. 4 separate voices, Peter, Paul, Jude, and Jesus himself, across 4 different books, all independently describing the same thing. Not that the sheep, or the believer, or the net happens to survive on its own strength, but that something outside it is actively, continuously holding on. That's a wide enough spread of independent witnesses that it stops looking like a devotional theme one author was fond of and starts looking like a settled New Testament conviction. That's the category the unbroken net belongs to. It isn't that the catch happened to be light enough to survive. It's that whatever held it wasn't the strength of the net or the men hauling it in. The same men, remember, who had just failed at their own trade for an entire night on their own strength, on this exact lake, using these exact nets. The abundance and the durability came from the same source at the same moment, and neither one was manufactured by the crew in the boat. Let's pull back for a second, because the chapter isn't finished making this point. It makes it one more time, a few verses later, beside the fire we just identified, in a scene most readers never connect to the net at all. If tracing a rare Greek word across 2 scenes in the same gospel and cross-referencing 3 independent New Testament voices on the same theological claim is the kind of close reading you want more of, consider becoming a member of the channel. It's what funds this level of research every week. And to those of you who already are members, thank you. You're part of everything produced here. Now, here's where the net, the fire, and the man standing beside both of them turn out to be telling exactly the same story. A few verses after the net is hauled ashore, still in this same chapter, beside the same rare kind of fire John has already flagged for us, Jesus turns to Peter directly. And what happens next is easy to read as a separate scene, but it's the same chapter, the same morning, the same fire, and almost certainly not a coincidence. 3 times Jesus asks Peter some version of, "Do you love me?" John 21:15-17. The number 3 is not incidental, it mirrors precisely the 3 times Peter denied even knowing Jesus during the trial, John 18:17, 25-27, beside that same rare word for a charcoal fire. Peter is not being interrogated, he's being restored. Given 3 fresh answers to lay directly over 3 failed ones, in the one location in the entire gospel guaranteed to bring the memory back. John even records that the repetition itself lands hard. By the 3rd question, the text tells us plainly, Peter was grieved because he said unto him the 3rd time, "Lovest thou me?" John 21:17. That grief is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. It isn't shame being reinforced for its own sake. It's the exact number of chances required to fully answer for the exact number of failures, no more and no fewer, until nothing is left unaddressed between them. And each time Peter answers, Jesus gives him something to do. Feed my lambs. Tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. That's not incidental language either. It places Peter directly inside a shepherd typology that runs through the rest of Scripture. Ezekiel's promise of a shepherd who would truly care for God's flock, which Jesus applies to himself earlier in John 10, is now in this very commissioning extended outward to Peter. And it's worth noticing that Peter appears to have carried this moment with him for the rest of his life. Years later, writing his own letter to church leaders, he instructs them to feed the flock of God and calls himself, specifically, a fellow elder among shepherds. 1 Peter 5:1-2. The same verb, the same image, now coming from the man who was once handed it beside a fire that should have only reminded him of failure. Here's the connection the chapter is making, and it's worth stating plainly. The net that should have broken under an impossible catch, and the disciple who should have been permanently disqualified by a public 3-time denial of Christ, both get held. Not by their own effort. Peter's own strength had already failed both times, once at his trade and once at his testimony. Both are restored by the same presence standing on the shore, beside the same fire, and the restored man is then handed responsibility for holding others the same way he was just held. So here's the whole shape of it, stated plainly. John places 3 images side by side in a single chapter. A net stretched past its previous breaking point that holds a disciple whose failure should have disqualified him, restored beside the very fire that marked that failure, and that same restored man handed responsibility to shepherd others. And all 3 point to the same claim. What Christ's post-resurrection presence supplies isn't just abundance. It's the power to hold and restore exactly what human effort, on its own, had already lost, and then to entrust it outward, to someone who has personally felt both the tearing and the holding. If there's an area of your life that feels like it's already torn, a relationship, a failure you can't undo, a version of yourself you thought had disqualified you from something, this passage doesn't ask you to try harder at mending it yourself. Peter didn't repair his own denial by trying harder at faithfulness afterward. He was asked the same question 3 times, standing in front of the same kind of fire, by the same person he'd failed in front of, at the location best designed to remind him of exactly what he'd done. What the text offers instead is a different question worth actually sitting with. Not, can I fix what's torn, but am I moving toward the shore or away from it? The first time Peter faced an overwhelming, undeserved provision, he asked Jesus to leave. The second time, he swam toward him before the boat could even land. That shift, not effort, not merit, not having earned the right to approach again, is what precedes everything else that happens in this chapter, including the commission that follows it. Whatever your version of the charcoal fire is, a specific memory you'd rather not stand near again, a failure you assumed permanently disqualified you from something you once hoped to do. The pattern this text lays out doesn't require you to have already resolved what happened there before you're allowed back near it. Peter wasn't asked to explain the denial, defend himself, or prove he'd changed before Jesus spoke to him. He was simply asked 3 times, plainly, whether he still loved him. The invitation came before the resolution, not after it. And notice what Peter is given once the restoration happens. Not a quiet, private absolution meant only for himself, but an assignment involving other people. Feed the lambs, tend the sheep. Whatever has been torn and mended in your own life isn't necessarily meant to end with you either. The same pattern that held you tends to become, eventually, something you're trusted to extend to somebody else standing where you once stood. The first time these nets couldn't hold what Jesus provided, and Peter didn't know what to do with a grace that large. So he asked for distance. The second time, the net held everything it was given, and Peter closed the distance himself, plunging into open water rather than waiting for the boat to land. And beside a fire that should have only reminded him of the worst thing he'd ever done, he wasn't handed a verdict. He was handed a flock. Same lake he'd fished his whole working life. Same kind of fire he'd once stood beside and lied 3 times to stay safe. A net that finally holds under more weight than it had ever carried before, and a man who finally moves towards the one holding it, rather than away. Whatever in your life currently feels torn past repair, this chapter doesn't end with the net or with Peter's failure. It ends with both of them restored, beside the exact fire that marked the failure, by a presence that was never depending on their strength to begin with. And it ends with that same restored man being trusted to hold others in the very ministry his own worst night should have permanently disqualified him from. If this changed how you read a passage you thought you already knew, subscribe so the next investigation finds you. And if one detail here landed differently than you expected, say so in the comments. Someone else standing at the edge of their own torn net today needs to see it too.